everyone, it's Sevy. Everyone already released their Durin videos, so I won't keep you guys waiting anymore. Durin is actually a really simple character. You know how Nilou has 2 forms, and to activate each form you just need to perform a certain combo with her skill? Well, Durin is pretty much that, but arguably simpler, I would say. So I'll just get ahead on this Razor language part, as a too long don't watch. Here goes. If you use Durin's skill, then his burst, he becomes light mode support Durin. If you use his burst without doing anything beforehand, he also becomes light mode support Durin. Now, light mode support Durin has faster and smaller pyro hits with enemy debuffs. If you use Durin's skill, then normal attack, then burst, he becomes dark mode carry Durin. Carry Durin has bigger and slower pyro hits with self buffs. And unless you want to keep him on the field, you can just swap him out after and have someone else on the field, because his burst does damage from off field. Now there you have it. If you want to get to know the details of this dragon kid actually, then keep on watching. Okay, so like my previous CE server videos, I'm just covering first impressions, kit explanations, and some team testing here. This isn't going to be a full prescriptive build guide, so there's that disclaimer, and I hope that you actually get some information out of this video. Anyway, here's the nitty-gritty of Durin's kit. Here's how he actually works. Starting with his normal attacks, there's nothing super special about them, but his charge attack is actually really cool. You can even cancel out of it, but that of course uses up stamina. Then we move on to his skill. Now before we get into the binary nature of his skill, it does one very important thing in either case. It gives Durin energy, and not just in the form of particles, which it supplies a lot of, by the way, but when he uses his skill in battle, he restores a whole bunch of energy. At talent level 9, that's 30 energy restored, and at talent level 10, that's 33 energy restored. His burst costs a total of 70 energy, so he's restoring almost half of that energy cost plus gaining pyro particles. So he won't need a lot of ER at all, but you will want to still have enough ER or enough energy to be comfortable based on your combat scenario, like if you're fighting a boss, because all of Durin's damage is in his burst. Okay, now moving on to the binary form of his skill. When he does his skill and then follows it up with another skill, he gains access to his light mode burst. Access to, by the way. And he deals 1 instance of AoE pyro damage to nearby enemies, and it kind of comes with this kind of jumping motion too. And then when he does his skill and follows it up with a normal attack, he gains access to his dark mode burst, and his skill does 3 instances of pyro damage to opponents in front of him. Now moving on to his burst, which follows the binary nature of his skills. When Durin activates his light mode burst, so skill burst, he deals 3 pyro hits to the opponents in front of him, and then starts dealing these AoE pyro attacks at 1-second intervals. This pyrosphere thing from his burst will target enemies near you. Be warned that if there are groups of enemies farther from you, the burst ticks likely won't hit it and will instead target the groups closer to you. Also, these bursts will apply pyro every 2 ticks, which will come in handy for determining melt and vape teams. And then from his passive, if a party member triggers a pyro-related reaction among burning, overloaded, pyro swirl, or pyro crystallize, or even sustaining burning further on an enemy, then that enemy's pyro resistance and resistance to the other element in that reaction gets decreased by 20% for 6 seconds. So let's say a party member triggers overloaded on an enemy, then their pyro resistance and electro resistance are going to get reduced by 20% for 6 seconds. So as you can see, this Durin is much more support oriented, hence light mode support Durin, offering faster pyro application and enemy debuffs for him and his teammates to make use of. Now when Durin uses his dark mode burst, which is skill, normal attack, then burst, he deals 3 pyro hits to enemies in front, and then his burst does single target pyro damage at 1.5-second intervals. These hits do have a higher multiplier than his light mode hits, as you can see, but their pyro application happens every other hit, which is a bit slower than his light mode. When in dark mode, his passive buffs Durin's own melt and vape damage by 40%, which is quite chunky actually. And we can tell that this form is much more tailored to increasing his own personal damage, making this sort of like the carry version of Durin. So in either case, these are all going to be considered burst damage, and they last for 20 seconds and have an 18-second cooldown, and the attacks actually at least have some range. For example, in the Stygian level with the Ectomosaur, Durin's attacks can hit it while it's all the way up there, like while it's flying. So before we wrap up his kit, let's look at his other passives. When there's another Hexerai character on the team, the effects from his Divine Calculus passive get increased by 75%, making these debuffs and self buffs extra chonky. That's going to be his Hexerai passive, and there are going to be 7 other Mondstadt Hexerai characters available in this patch. As you can see from my previous video, you can check out what their buffs are going to be. Then he has another passive passive that comes with a huge chunk of text, but the TLDR of it is that his burst hits get buffed based on his attack stat. And that makes his attack stat a very, very valuable stat for him actually. The buff caps out at 75% multiplier, which is equivalent to 2500 attack for Durin. That won't be too difficult to reach on a regular basis, but it should definitely be your target when building him. He gets 10 instances of this buff for his burst hits, and even if a single attack hits multiple opponents, it actually only consumes one of those instances. So if you have opponents grouped very tightly and those hits manage to hit all of them at once, that's really, really good. So after 10 hits, his burst ticks won't have that buff anymore. And then he has his exploration passive, which is 25% more rewards from Mondstadt expeditions and all that good stuff. So as a quick summary to Durin's kit, he basically does a lot of pyro burst damage with relatively good pyro application actually. It's from off field especially, it's faster than a lot of the characters we currently have. Light Durin decreases enemies' pyro resistance and elemental resistance of the other element in that reaction, and then Dark Durin increases his own personal vaporize and melt damage as well. So moving on to some important things to note, or some things we can infer from his kit, it's actually really important to level up his skill talent so that you can maximize that energy restoration and make for smooth sailing when it comes to your rotations and your energy generation. Aside from that, most of his damage is considered burst damage. Now this might make you immediately turn towards the Emblem of Severed Fate artifact set to buff his burst damage, and while that is viable for him, remember that his ER requirements aren't even that high, so he might not even be able to make full use of Emblem of Severed Fate's burst damage buff. So Noblesse is a good alternative since it does buff his burst damage plus gives the team some extra attack buffs as well. That being said though, it's very, very likely they're going to give him a dedicated artifact set in the future. Let's be real, he's a pretty notable character in the lore and the story, and I don't think Genshin is going to hold back on showering him with gifts. Again, his attack stat is going to be very important to him, so aim for at least 2500 attack to cap out that passive of his. Alright, moving on to Durin's teams, and I am in a different outfit because I did the team testing and the team conclusions in this section on a different day. So anyway, let's talk about it. Look guys, Durin's a pyro character with actually good pyro applications, so there are going to be a lot of teams and reactions that he can fit into. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, and I don't even know if I'll reach most of them because if I try, I'll be listing them down till the cows come home. But for most of the footage here, I am using him on his R1 signature weapon for reference, which admittedly does buff his numbers compared to if he were just using a 4-star or non-signature weapon. But when it comes to certain teams, the viability of the team is also heavily judged on how well elemental reactions can be set up, so I'm mostly trying to observe that. And I want to start with Vape and Melt teams, his Dark Durin specialties. These are a bit tough because I did want to pair Dark Durin with Bennett for the attack buff, but you have to on-field Durin for him to take advantage of that. And I've got a C6 Bennett in public servers, so I also wanted to simulate that. So starting with Vaporize, with Yelan and Farina as my Hydro applicators, I didn't have a problem making Durin the one consistently triggering reverse Vaporize, even with a Pyro infusion caused by C6 Bennett. I had Durin on field for a chunk of the rotation to get Bennett's buffs, and there wasn't really much of a problem here against a single target enemy. And then I tried combos of Farina and Mona or Yelan and Mona to see what it would look like with his Hexerai enabled, and I only got consistent reverse vapes with the Yelan and Mona team between them. So my takeaway here is that you definitely still want pretty fast Hydro application for Durin if you're playing him with a C6 Bennett in his dark mode, since using this Pyro infused normal attacks is going to add extra Pyro application. However, if you're not using C6 Bennett, then Durin can still vape pretty consistently on his dark mode, even with slower application. I tried that team with Farina and Mona and Dark Durin, and if he wasn't doing Pyro infused normal attacks, then he was still able to get those reverse vapes. So it might take some messing around with, especially based on your own character roster. I'm not sure which Hydro characters you have, but it's definitely possible to make him consistently reverse vape, which, you know, is the goal. He's literally built for that. Anyway, in the case of forward melting, as you'd probably expect, it's also pretty rough with a C6 Bennett since all the Pyro overtakes the Cryo quite easily, even if you have 2 Cryo units. But again, that's not really that much of an obstacle if your Bennett isn't C6, or if you're not even using Bennett or trying to take advantage of on-field buffs. For example, I was able to get some good forward melting by on-fielding Cryo application, like with Risley, for example, or through 2 Cryos and Venti absorbing Cryo Pyro with his burst. Light mode Durin, by the way, does make a good Pyro applicator for a cryo DPS to reverse meld with, but it's just that this scenario wouldn't really make use of either form of Durin's passive that either shreds enemy resistance or buffs his own damage. Even then, I think that Durin's melt teams can still be pretty strong. It's just that sometimes you'll have a split of which characters are triggering the melt reactions. And honestly, that isn't necessarily a bad thing if your cryo units are well built for damage also. And then of course I tried other reaction teams for his light mode because he does enable those. He does offer something for those teams. There was the double Geo, double Pyro where I used Durin, Navia, Albedo, and Bennett. And I've played this 2 Pyro 2 Geo team a lot with Xiangling, so it's nice to finally have another character that I can put in there instead, which is Durin as an off-field Pyro, alongside his enemy resistance shred. And then Albedo's just here to enable the Hexer passive, but remember that Zhongli's shield also offers extra resistance shred, so don't feel too locked into Albedo. I also tried overload teams with Chevreuse. The usual 4-star team of Sevy, Bennett, and Fischl, it does work nicely enough actually. It goes pretty smoothly. But when I did with Veressa in Stygian 5, I was like, oh my lord, why is she doing numbers? I don't have Veressa on my own account, so the CE server is the rare time that I do get to play her a lot, and she's really fun. But she's also really great with Durin. It was just a great team overall. And the extra resistance shred that Durin's light mode offers, it's a good pro. Like, I love it. And then as a derivative, I also tried Overvape using Farina and Fischl. Overall, between Durin's dark mode and light mode, because Durin's dark mode does strengthen his Vaporize damage, right? I did prefer using his light mode to shred Pyro and Electro resistance, because here Fischl can get in a lot of hits, so she benefits a lot from the Electro resistance shred, and I wasn't seeing a ton of Vaporizes from Durin to favor his dark mode more, but that might need further testing, like with different units. I also toyed around a bit with Kenichi burning, which went pretty much as expected. I mean, it's kind of a straightforward team, right? It's just that in this chamber and Spiral Abyss that we had to test with in particular, it kind of needs extra crowd control because it's groups of enemies over and over again, and sometimes Durin's light mode doesn't have enough AoE to catch all of them in one hit. And then there is some potential for Durin Burgeon also, but you'll need a lot of Hydra application, I think, to keep up with his light mode hits so that you don't end up with too much burning on the enemies. Overall, lots of teams to try out. Again, I probably didn't even touch the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of units that you can substitute here also for those different teams because Genshin just has a lot of characters available. So let me know in the comments who you're going to be trying him out with, and let's move to the next section. Okay, quickly, let's go over his constellations. I was testing him at C0, but in case you're interested in pulling his constellations, let's check them out. So C1, it has different effects based on whether he's on light form or dark form. When he is in light form, support Durin. He gives something like Shenhe quills to his team. He gives 20 instances of buffs to his teammates based on 60% of Durin's attack. Damage instances from any attack by a teammate are going to consume those quill stacks. To lean on the safe side, I will assume that multiple damage instances consume multiple quills, since in Durin's case, when that wasn't the case, then they had to specify that. Usually, multiple instances of damage consume multiple quills. And then if he's dark mode, then Durin gets 20 instances of buffs for himself, and his burst hits consume 2 instances of that buff to increase his damage by 150% of his attack. So again, he's buffing himself here. And I think this is a pretty strong constellation actually, especially in his support mode, because that's a lot of instances, 20 instances. And if you get his attack up to 2500, then each instance is adding a base damage of 1500. Genshin has been releasing some strong constellation ones recently, and in my opinion, this seems to be no exception. And him buffing himself is going to be pretty chonky as well. And then for his C2, for 20 seconds after Durin uses his burst, when a pyro reaction is triggered by a teammate, the team gets 50% pyro damage and 50% elemental damage bonus of the element involved in the reaction. So once again, if you trigger overloaded, then the team gets 50% pyro damage and 50% electro damage. Now I do wonder if this can happen to multiple reactions and buff multiple elements because it doesn't state a limitation. So it's likely that you can get multiple multiple elements buffed in this way. His C3 gives 3 levels to his burst talent. His C4, his elemental burst gets a 40% damage buff, and then when his C1 stacks are triggered, then there's a 30% chance that the stacks won't be consumed. So basically, in a gacha multi-step process, there is a chance that he gets more of his C1 buffs, or more uses of them basically. And then C5, his skill talent increases by 3, and then C6, Durin's burst ignores 30% of enemies' defense. When he's in light mode, after his light mode burst hits an enemy, their defense gets reduced further by 30% for 6 seconds. When he's in dark mode, damage from his burst additionally ignores 40% of enemies' defense, which is a huge C6. We don't get a lot of defense ignorers or defense debuffs from characters. So C6, basically Durin is just going to be dealing a lot of damage, whether as light mode or dark mode. As light mode, of course, he allows his teammates to deal a lot more damage as well by actually reducing the enemy's defense. But you know, what else can we expect from a C6 aside from like making them super broken? So to cap off this video, I want to share my first impressions, or rather just my thoughts on Durin after testing him for a while, like several hours on the CE server, and probably to give you some insight as well as to whether or not he's a good pull for you, or whether or not you should pull him. So Durin, like the thing with him is that he's basically versatility incarnate. Like he quite literally has a support mode and a carry mode. Most characters in Genshin, they're either one or the other. They're not necessarily both. Sometimes there's a support mode that offers like sub DPS level damage. Sometimes they have a carry mode and then no other support functionalities. But Genshin chose to give him both capabilities, and honestly, I find it quite interesting. I do like how his support mode actually helps teams that may not be considered as meta, such as Burning, Burgeon, and then Crystallize or Geo teams, and that doesn't entirely buff the teams into oblivion or into the top of the meta, but it at least makes it feel better for those who like playing those teams. And then I would have said Overload, but I do think that Overload has already been getting better over time, like with Chevreuse. I think Moika and Veressa also do well for Overload teams. But of course, Durin is an extra buff or an extra unit that can benefit Overload teams a lot as well, and that just showed in the teams that I tried him in. He does great in those Veressa teams and those Overload teams in general. And then his carry mode is quite strong also. Like it's obviously built for Vaporize and Melt team because his passive does buff his Vaporize and Melt damage, and while it may take some experimenting with your roster at which teammates will optimize your elemental application the most, I think his numbers have considerably good payoff. Now, one thing that I wasn't able to test here was Mona with her Constellations on. I know a lot of creators have shown that C4 Mona does a lot for Durin, and I think that especially with Mona being a Hexerite character and her being a Hydra character, she can enable those teams for him really well and get his numbers up. So it's just a matter of finding the right teammates to slot into those other two spots. And then I think that Durin, when it comes to pulling him, he's an amazing pull if you're looking for a flexible unit with great longevity for Pyro teams moving forward. I know that people kind of refer to him as like a 5-star Xiangling, right? And maybe we won't ever get like a unit that has 0 ICD on their elemental application ever again, but Durin's Pyro app is already really good compared to what most other Pyro units offer in the first place. And he gives other utilities on top of that, which are all pluses in my opinion. Now, personally, I'm not super drawn to him because I don't really feel a gap in my own character roster, and I enjoy playing my Alahatham teams and my Blins teams a lot more than Pyro teams as of now, and there are other Notcry units that I am saving up for. However, I do think that Durin will become a heavily referenced teammate for future meta teams. So if that's like your goal, your objective, to have units that like constantly keep up with the meta or that are very flexible with those types of reaction teams, then I think that Durin is just going to be an amazing pull that is going to be around for a while in those very common teams. Anyway, that's going to be all for this video about Durin. Good luck on your Durin pulls. I also have a redeem code down in the pinned comment and the description. Let me know how your pulls go, and also let me know what your thoughts are on Durin so far, whether you've played him from the official release or just seen a bunch of footage about him. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel for more content, and I will see you soon. Take care.